Nixon had specifically an insecurity about himself, where he didn't feel a kind of affirmation from the universe. He didn't feel, and to put it in explicitly Christian terms, loved by God. He couldn't sort of rest and say, I did what I did, and God be my judge, and Jesus loves me, and you don't have to, something like that. Well, you could tell the story this way, and you would kind of speculatively reimagine everything that had happened, and it, that simultaneously makes it really fascinating. I think he's forced out because of the cover-up, not because of the crime. I think normally when you hear cover-up, you just think like they hid something, right? Or they like blocked an investigation, and there's that too. But really, the lived experience of the cover-up was this intensive interpretation and reinterpretation and reimagination of all the details.
Hello, and welcome to the Upwards Podcast. I'm Dan, one of your hosts, and today I'm talking with Daniel Silliman, a reporter for Christianity Today, who just released a new biography of Richard Nixon. And this is a unique biography because it's a religious biography. We get into Nixon's upbringing in the Quaker tradition. We get into the ways that Nixon talked about religion as a politician, as the president. We talk about Watergate. We also talk about Nixon's relationship to famous Christians like Billy Graham, a really interesting and long relationship they had. So please enjoy this Upwards conversation with Daniel Silliman. Welcome to the Upwards Podcast, where we discuss the intersection of Christian faith in the academy, church, and marketplace to illuminate the good work happening with individuals, institutions, and our communities. I'm excited to be here today with Daniel Silliman. Hi, Daniel.
Hey, good to be back.
Yes, Daniel's a returning guest. He was on our program last year. And if you're interested in some of Daniel's personal story, how he got into the work he's into, which I'll get to in just a minute, but includes reporting on religion and also writing books about religious history, please check out that interview from last year in the podcast notes. We are here today to talk about Richard Nixon, which is always a good topic, particularly with someone who has spent a lot of time in possibly the deepest, darkest corners of Nixon's life, which is Daniel and his new book. So let me introduce Daniel, and then we'll get to the book. Daniel Silliman is the senior news editor, recently promoted, of Christianity Today. He earned a doctorate in American Studies from Heidelberg University in Germany and has taught U.S. history and humanities at Heidelberg, the University of Notre Dame, Valparaiso University, and Milligan University. And I commend you to his newest book, One Lost Soul, Richard Nixon's Search for Salvation, which just came out with Erdman's Press. So this is a spiritual history, a spiritual biography of Richard Nixon, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So Daniel, I'll just start with asking you, what drew you to the person of Nixon, to where you wanted to spend multiple years of your life on this man and this topic?
Yeah, you do, writing a biography, get to know someone very well. You learn how they think, you learn to hear their voice. You spend many waking hours, but also sleeping hours. I found that I didn't quite anticipate how much I would also dream about Richard Nixon. So, be forewarned for anybody who's thinking about it. It's a journey. It's a process. Yeah, I mean, there were kind of two things that drew me to Nixon. I mean, the first one is just as a 20th century historian, 20th century America, you come across Nixon kind of all the time. And there's a way in which it doesn't matter what topic in the 20th century you're interested in, Nixon still comes up. I mean, I exaggerate, but only slightly. You are reading about the Cold War, Nixon's there. You're reading about the shifts and evolution in American conservatism and the Republican Party, and Nixon's there. You care about civil rights, and Nixon is there. Like, Nixon is in the middle. Even if he's not your main subject, he just comes up a lot. And so at some point, I just had this, I need to read more about him. I need to study more about him. He seems, almost more than any other one person in the 20th century, just really kind of in the middle of things. And then I would say that the second thing for me was that I felt an identification with Nixon. I felt I don't know if I want to say connection, but I felt a similarity. I felt wait a minute, there's something here that I feel like I know intuitively, that I feel like I respond to. He's a very weird person. He's a very sort of idiosyncratic character, especially for someone who's quite as powerful as he is. I think a lot of times, powerful people have a certain charm, charisma, golden glow all the time. They just seem like they've always just spent a week at the beach at all times. And that is not Richard Nixon. And there's something about his introversion, his scowling, his tendency to feel hurt, his anxiety around his successes, that I just kept thinking, wait, this feels very familiar. Know something here. And I kind of wanted to dig into that part of what he did and who he was for that reason. It's not like, oh man, I just love Richard Nixon, he's the best. It's more like the things that are unlikable about him, the things that I don't like, also feel uncomfortably familiar, and thus history can be a way of digging into those things.
So, Daniel, we've heard a bit about how central Nixon was to much of the 20th century. But say you're on the elevator with a 20-something-year-old, someone who was born after Nixon died in 1994. What are the key moments of his life, or the key stats of his life, that give us a sense of how significant he really was?
Yeah, well, first of all, he's president of the United States for 2 terms, vice president for 2 terms, significant political figure. A lot of people know he's the opponent in Kennedy's first race when Kennedy gets elected. But then, every president's a significant major figure in history. The most important thing about Nixon is that he's the only president in American history who ends his presidency forced from the White House. So he is disgraced, gets caught up in a scandal called the Watergate scandal, where men who worked for him broke into the Democratic Party headquarters and bugged the phones to try and give him an unfair advantage in the election. And he was caught, and he recorded himself talking about how to cover it up. And all of that was exposed, and he was forced out. And the tumult of that and the trauma of that becomes absolutely defining to the end of the 20th century, and is still really key to the kind of shape of public life in America today, was that final disgrace of Richard Nixon.
Right. And as maybe a trivial way of recognizing that, any scandal today will have the gate suffix on it in part. And that comes out of Watergate. That would make no sense before the Watergate scandal.
That is directly attached to Watergate. Yeah.
Right. So now we have, Gamergate, or something that's totally disconnected from presidential politics, but still implies this sort of scandalous, conspiratorial background to it.
And Watergate was just the name of the office complex and hotel where the Democratic Party headquarters had, but it became kind of shorthand for the whole scandal.
The whole scandal, that's right. Okay, one interesting thing about this book, One Lost Soul, was at the way end, you have a note on the sources, and it just is sort of you narrating how you actually get into researching someone who is so well known, seemingly, as Nixon. Hundreds and hundreds of books have been written about Nixon, who knows how many newspaper articles and so forth. So just walk us through, how did you get to know Nixon, and particularly zero in on this part of his life that may be a lot less studied, which is his religious and spiritual commitments. But how do you tackle someone like Nixon, who I can imagine, the only similar type people in American history would be like Lincoln or George Washington, or someone who has just been studied over and over again, and seemingly there's nothing new to say, but you found something new to say. So how does that process go?
Yeah, it's both a challenge of he's a complicated and pivotal person, and therefore a lot of historians have been drawn to him. And then it's also a challenge that in part because of him attempting to cover stuff up, lots and lots of stuff was saved. So the actual record was just overwhelming. And this is true for most 20th century and 21st century presidents, like just the pile of stuff. I mean, I can find in the archives for any day he was president, I can find a record that tells you how many minutes he spoke to his wife. And you're just like, this is too, and that's before, it's too much, even before you get to the point where he was recording every conversation that he
Right.
had in one of the official rooms that he had them. And you just think, like, do I have to live every minute of his life in order to, like, know what this says? So that's an interesting challenge. A lot of history and a lot of journalism has the opposite challenge, where there's too little stuff.
Right.
And you're like, how do I find the one existing record or detail or fragment of a document? My friends who do ancient history are writing whole monographs where they have like 3 lines of text or something, and I'm just drowning in stuff, which sounds like a good problem to have. In a lot of ways it is, but it does also present a challenge. I mean, you have to develop a knack for it. But first of all, I started with the big established books that other people have written. History's done in conversation with other historians. You're not sort of inventing the wheel and reinventing the wheel. And even though in the actual text, I don't spend a lot of time sort of arguing historiography with other people, I did want to spend time thinking, like, well, how did they think through this person?
Mm-hmm.
And there, what I noted is what sent me to do a religious biography. What I noted was that they would mention a lot of these religious details and sort of interesting moments and glimpses of a religious life. But for them, that's not the interesting part, right? They're narrating a political journey or a political agenda, or how he, made some choice electorally. And so they would note something and maybe even note the political consequence it had, but they wouldn't kind of sit with it or dig deeper. So an example of that is that when Nixon's in the White House, he decides not to go to church like most presidents before him did, go to church in Washington, D.C. Instead, he decided to organize church in the White House and pick his own preachers and pick his own choirs and even also pick his own congregation month by month. And that's mentioned. That's not like new information to me. That's mentioned in the political biographies, but that's kind of all they say. And I wanted to dig into it more. How did he make those decisions? Which ministers did he pick? What kind of sermons did they preach? Was there any tension around the question of who would come Sunday to Sunday? And there was. And so I had to, when I finally got a chance to go to the archives, I've read all of this other stuff. I've noted there's this question about the church service. I then go looking for that thing in the archives. Like somewhere, surely there's a file where they're having debates, some sort of trace, historical trace or historical record that shows kind of what was going on. And I did. I found several files of memos and debates and decisions, decision-making processes and decisions that were made in that. So a lot of it is like studying the breadth of things, studying it at a high level, reading basically everything you can in order to find the things that you're going to zero in on. And then when you get the chance, like going and looking at some things that you already know are there, just more closely and more intensely than other historians have, because they haven't been cared about the same things that you do. The other thing I would say that helped me a lot, you kind of have to develop an instinct and a little bit of a, like, when I feel this way, then I know I've researched enough, right? How do I know that I've got what I need? And one thing that I found with that, which is, particular to Nixon, was that when I read enough and then on a topic or an era or a decision, and then I went and read what he wrote in particular, and he has 3 autobiographies in addition to speeches and notes and whatever. But when I had done my research, I could read what he said and immediately spot the lies. Like he would phrase things in a particularly self-advantageous way. It's maybe a little harsh to call them lies. Sometimes they're very clearly lies. Other times it's just sort of like spin or shading or, putting the best interpretation on it. And if I could see that really quickly, I would say, okay, like I understand that. And part of that is because it turns out he's not the most trustworthy source. But the other piece there is that he's only doing that shading on the things that are actually pretty important to the story that he wants to tell and are pretty connected to the way that he feels about some kind of situation. So I use that a little bit to as a check for myself. Do I got it? Do I kind of know what I'm talking about here? Well, if I can see how he is going to try and push a certain narrative over another one, then that's a good way for me to confirm I know what I'm talking about.
Mm. It's an interesting point you make that I think anyone who's really skilled at something probably understands when you move from that rational down to the intuitive level on some of the things you do to be good at whatever skill it is. And it's hard to articulate, but you definitely know it. And it usually takes, it's the 10,000 hour rule or whatever. You got to do it enough to know, to basically have things that develop below the level of conscious reasoning to do it. But that's interesting. I wonder, as you mentioned, Nixon wrote 3 autobiographies or memoirs, I guess, of his time in office and rest of his life. I wonder if that's another thing that makes him unique. I'm not sure this would make him unbelievably unique, but I don't know. I'm thinking through like the modern presidents since World War II, if anyone had spent so much time litigating their own legacy through writing. Carter was very wrote a lot, but it wasn't all on his own 4 years in office and sort of trying to hash out who was right and who was wrong. And part of that might be that Nixon also had people like Henry Kissinger in his administration who also wrote a ton about their time in office. And so I'm sure he felt a little prodded on by other people getting their version out, and he wanted to get his version out. But it does seem to me that he had, and that goes to your bigger thesis about what he was concerned about, but he had a disproportionate interest after leaving office, partly because how he left office, in litigating what exactly happened during his time in office. Would you say that's right?
Yeah, I think that's right. He may not have literally written the most, but he also might have. I haven't checked. His one autobiography is over 1,000 pages long. Right. It is quite a tome. His model, interestingly enough, was Winston Churchill. That was who he was like emulating overtly. So not an American politician, but a controversial politician who similar to how he saw himself, both was at the center of some major shaping events, but also was quite controversial and kind of needed to litigate his own legacy and litigate here, let me explain the 20th century to you or something like that. But yeah, I think that actually goes to the larger argument that I'm making, which is that Nixon had specifically an insecurity about himself, where he didn't feel a kind of affirmation from the universe. He didn't feel, and to put it in explicitly Christian terms, loved by God. He couldn't sort of rest and say, I did what I did, and God be my judge, and Jesus loves me, and you don't have to, something like that. I mean, I think if you compare it to George W. Bush, also quite controversial, also has been quite litigated, he seems like someone who kind of doesn't need to defend himself. Like he kind of is happy to paint dogs. Like that's who he is in his post-presidency, as opposed to this sort of anxiety about having the record speak for him. And Nixon literally had conversations about this, some of which I quote in the book, where Henry Kissinger, his national security advisor, also quite a strange and complicated figure, would say like, "Oh, Mr. President, don't worry, history will treat you much kinder than your contemporaries." And Nixon was like, "Yeah, I don't know about that." And he would say, "Well, it depends on who writes the history." And he intended to write the history. He was kind of hoping to force, through intensive work and through his own will, force history to look the way that he wanted and kind of win that approval that escaped him kind of his whole life.
Well, we'll get to Nixon and his religious upbringing here in just a second. For the listeners who are listening to this on audio, for the notes in the podcast today, there is also a link to view this episode on YouTube for your convenience. And remember to follow or subscribe to stay updated with our latest episodes in your podcast app. So, Daniel, if people have a passing recognition of Nixon's religious background, they probably know he grew up a Quaker. So let us know, just tell us, what did that mean for Nixon, and what was it like to grow up in the Nixon household?
Yeah, Quakers are such an interesting religious tradition, both simultaneously like familiar to people and a complete mystery, which I have to say Nixon liked quite a lot. People seemed to misunderstand what being a Quaker meant to him, and he never corrected them and was always happy with their sort of basic, kind of the obfuscation of it. So, I mean, Quakers are known for being a kind of radical Protestant group that believes in rejection of all hierarchy, and God is so close to you. He speaks to each person directly, kind of a priesthood of all the believers idea, but even more intense enough that traditionally they didn't have paid clergy. They wouldn't have a minister. The idea that a minister like officially speaks to God or speaks for God was anathema to them, and they would instead sit in silence until the Holy Spirit moved someone, and they would quake, and that's where they got their name, and then that person would talk on that day. Nixon's religious upbringing wasn't quite like that, though. That's sort of the image of it. But his group had some experience with revivals, had been influenced by some Methodists, and identified as evangelical Quakers, and really looked more like other Protestant churches. A little plain, a little austere, a little more emphasis on simplicity, more likely to hear a sermon about pacifism and rejection of violence, but otherwise, like basically use American Protestantism, with a kind of unique tradition, but not that distinguishable. What you really notice when you dig into Nixon's childhood, though, and his religious upbringing, is this emphasis on work. He's taught that being a Christian mostly means being good and following rules and living up to your Quaker name. You're not just given this. You have to prove yourself. You have to earn it. You have to labor quite a bit. He got that at home as well. His mother had sort of intense ambitions for him, named him after a British king, Richard. Named all her kids after King, talked about maybe him being a concert pianist, and taught him Latin and had him memorize Shakespeare performances. And it was that kind of upbringing. At the same time, was very reticent to show any emotion or affection. She considered affection sloppy. And so she never told him that she loved him, according to his account. And he would, of course, hurry to say, and she didn't have to, but she didn't hesitate to tell him that he needed to work harder. She didn't hesitate to tell him, he should strive to be the best and that maybe he could accomplish something. But she did hesitate to say, oh, and also, I love you and you're my son. And I'm so happy that you exist. At the same time, his father, as sort of reserved as his mother was, his father was loud, blustery, fighty. Pretty much every recollection of him, I found a lot of sort of oral histories that had been done by a local college professor teaching his students how to do oral history. And they went and interviewed lots of people in the neighborhood who'd grown up around the Nixons. And they all remember Nixon's mom as quiet and talk about her as a saint. And they all remember his father as the kind of tyrant, yelling, occasionally violent, explosive. He liked to tell people they were wrong about stuff and at volume. And Nixon grew up working for his dad. His dad owned a gas station and grocery store. So he's not only has this father who's sort of prone to anger and outbursts, he also is working for that person, and specifically getting this anger and outwork around how hard he's working and whether he's working hard enough. So at home, at work, at church, at school, he's really taught a kind of ethic of work, a kind of theology of you need to strive to be good enough. You need to labor to be good enough. And that's more distinctive than anything about, sitting in silence and waiting till the Holy Spirit moves or something like that.
I think one of the really interesting parts of the book is just this early period where you really, I appreciated the conditions under which Nixon grew up, and then just the hard life he lived. A lot of work, difficult, at least for most of us, though Nixon would say it wasn't, a difficult family life, deaths of siblings that
He had
really
two
shaped
brothers
his,
die of tuberculosis. Yeah.
right. So really shaped his, his early upbringing then. And then even getting into college and law school at Duke. I believe he lived in a shack. Is that right? Sort of
Yeah.
off
Lived in a
campus.
shack with like 4 or 5 other guys without running water. He actually hid a razor at the law library behind some books and would shave in the law library. Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
an incredible hard worker. They said he at one point was sort of bemoaning the fact that everybody else had a better education than him at law school and came from a better school, and like, I don't know if I can really succeed here. I feel so intimidated. And the older student said, you'll be okay. You've got an iron butt, and that's what you need. And he really took that to heart, and both in law school and kind of the rest of his life would, try and succeed through sheer hard work, which obviously is something that's quite admirable and often a good way to go through life, and yet also has this other effect where it's like, but you also need to sometimes just experience love and receive love, and not only be measured by what you can produce and by what you can achieve. And he seemed to benefit from that work ethic while also struggling that was sort of the only metric of value that he had for himself.
Yeah, that really comes through. And I think that's probably one of the more, depending on your own personality, but one of the more relatable parts of who Nixon was is there was all of the striving and none of the grace, or none of the rest in the Lord verses made it into his personal repertoire. So yeah, very interesting. I think the book is well detailed, jumps from sort of episodes in Nixon's life from his early upbringing through his political career. We'll just hit on a couple of them here. I just picked out a couple because of I think ways that we can trace some of his religious and spiritual thinking and development. But really, to move to the next part, when Nixon becomes a political figure, a national figure, is through being a congressman and being involved in a lot of the early anti-communism politics of the United States. For people who read up on the history, this is the era of the McCarthyite era. Is the late 40s, early 50s. Hard to recover, I think, for us today exactly how that era felt, though maybe certain things have come and gone since then that have we use that, speaking of Watergate and Gate, we use McCarthyite a lot in a lot of different ways now to describe, sort of ideologically driven thought policing, language policing in our culture. But it seems like this is another point where Nixon's religious background, or at least some of his sensibilities growing up in a Protestant context, sort of came to the fore in his anti-communism, which became one of the ways many people knew him. So talk to us about Nixon and anti-communism.
Yeah, that's right. There are some ways in which his beliefs about hard work and only hard work come to the fore. I also think there's almost a little bit of a maturing faith, or maybe even a conversion to something that in the book I called Cold War Christianity. He ends up being convinced as a young congressman that the Cold War ideological struggle between Christian America and atheist Soviet Union, between capitalism and communism, is, the most important issue of the day, as a sort of world historical fork in the road, and it's a worthy fight to throw your life into. He goes to Congress actually as a sort of young veteran post-World War II, mostly focused on kind of bread and butter issues, or actually like orange prices in Southern California, and price controls that are connected to a shortage of meat availability to housewives in Southern California. So runs and wins on sort of practical economic issues, and then is persuaded pretty quickly that what he really wants to do is engage in this high level kind of ideological historical struggle, and that's moral, that's a religious conflict that's happening. curiously, again, this is one of those details that's noted a lot, but people don't spend a bunch of the other historians haven't spent a bunch of time with. He's convinced of that in large part by a Catholic priest, a guy named Father John Cronin, who was the kind of chief lobbyist for the Catholic Church in the United States and would help the Catholic Church figure out, where they stood on unions and those types of issues. And he also had done some research on communism and specifically the question about Soviet spying and communist subversion in the government. And he'd written this kind of investigative reports into fellow travelers, people who were working in the government who might be secretly communist or so sympathetic to communism that they would be traitors actually to the United States and to this ideological commitment. Nixon then ends up, he's persuaded of this and thinks this is important. And then he ends up almost accidentally on the House of Un-American Activities Committee, which is nicknamed HUAC. Its abbreviation is HUAC, and it's just the House committee whose job it is to investigate communism. And they're mostly a kind of bumbling, showboating bunch of, like, when you read about what they did before Nixon gets there, it's pretty embarrassing. And Nixon, as someone who basically agreed with them politically, was also like, oh no, this is terrible. Please don't put me on this committee. That's where people go to embarrass themselves into oblivion, chasing down rumors that like Hollywood stars are secretly communist or something.
Mm-hmm.
But he's convinced by Father John Cronin that it's serious. And then there's a hearing where a Time magazine editor named Whittaker Chambers who used to be a spy and is testifying that he used to be a communist spy before he went through his own conversion experience and came out the other side an anti-communist. And Whittaker Chambers mentions a government official that he worked with who was a spy by the name of Alger Hiss. And Nixon recognizes the name Hiss was in John Cronin's investigative report and chooses to pursue this one investigative thread as a way to do the work of the House of Un-American Activities Committee seriously and for real. And so he sort of stages this conflict and pursues this conflict between these two men, Chambers and Hiss, as a political theater and investigative work, and also as this kind of religious struggle, and tries to prove that Chambers is correct, which we know now that he was, that Hiss really had been a spy and had been passing government secrets on to the communist. A wild detail of that story, this really is the first time he becomes famous. A wild detail of that story is that Chambers, in his conversion, also becomes Quaker. So he works with Nixon in part because they're both Quaker. He sees Nixon's a Quaker and he's converted to Quakerism, and he thinks like this man will recognize the truth and will respond to the truth. And then one of the details that, Chambers is saying, I knew Hiss, I knew him so well. Hiss is saying, I don't know this guy at all. He's making up some crazy story about me. I'm a very respectable man, and this guy just came off the street is accusing me of dumb things. So Chambers has to come up with all these details that he knows about Hiss's life. And one of them is that Hiss's wife is Quaker, which is not quite public. And in private, they refer to each other as thee and thou in this sort of old-fashioned Quaker language. So this major fight over communism when Nixon's in Congress ends up involving, a Catholic priest and 3 Quakers. It's kind of all below the surface. It's not how people are typically thinking of it. But I want to argue that that's actually pretty important to understanding how the shape of that.
Yeah, and it comes through really well, this sort of secret history of religious, at least, certain parts of different religious traditions and how they shape much bigger policy and political debates. One of the people I think certainly most evangelicals, but maybe many others associate Nixon with is Billy Graham, who, as you documented, was sort of along with the ride with Nixon for most of Nixon's political career.
Yeah.
Including to the end. Give us a sense of what his relationship to Billy Graham was. And I think there's probably at least 2 extremes. Maybe some people view this as a relationship that really was about the truth of the things they held together, and that there was a shared value system here that they were pushing about a certain type of America. I think there's also the other end, which I encounter quite a lot, which is a very cynical view that these were people using each other. Nixon needed Graham to get religious authority, religious legitimacy. Graham wanted Nixon because it gave him political legitimacy. I think you come somewhere in the middle, but how do you describe the relationship?
Yeah, I think kind of both of those things are true to certain measures. Billy Graham, as people may know, was sort of the most famous minister in the 20th century, was an evangelist who did these sort of big events, and year after year was ranked as like the most admired person in America, as this sort of very public, high profile minister who would at revivals, and they called them crusades. He also identified himself as like pastor to presidents and really wanted to be available to American presidents for religious counseling. And from I think Harry Truman on, sort of had a relationship with every president. The last one he met with in office was Obama, but actually several presidents after that he had relationships with. I found in the archives a file of his correspondence with Joe Biden, which is still embargoed. It's not open because Biden's still active in politics, but very continuing influence. But of all of those people, Graham had the closest relationship with Nixon, and it seems clear to me in the archival record that they're actually friends, that there's a closeness and a personal level of their relationship that one struck me as not the most common for adult men in the 1950s, and maybe even today. But they're connected on a pretty close level. And this does involve deep mutual interest in politics, a deep mutual some shared agenda for where they want to see America going and what they want to have happen. And Graham coaches Nixon along the way of like how to speak about his religious faith in a way that will resonate with different groups of religious voters. And Nixon promotes Graham and brings Graham into the White House. So there is some mutual using of each other, as well as some spiritual counseling and a kind of pastor-parishioner relationship sometimes, and also a deep friendship. Maybe one of the weirdest moments that I found was at one point in '68, Nixon actually asked Billy Graham if he wanted to be vice president. Just kind of in passing, he's just like, hey, do you want to be vice president? Graham kept a diary specifically of his relationship with Nixon. So he would sort of, after every encounter with Nixon, dictate what had happened. So there's a pretty good historical record of at least his recollection of all of those encounters. And he was sort of startled and says in his diary, like, I kind of think I could have been I think it was really, I mean, I guess he could have just been saying it, but I think it was real. But yeah, that's an interesting relationship. At the same time, there's definitely some times where Nixon is very cynical and manipulative and is using Graham in ways that he knows Graham wouldn't be happy with. And Graham seems to, make some assumptions about his friend and the spiritual state of his friend, and think things like, well, we share a political vision, we must also share some religious commitments. And he kind of doesn't probe in the way that you would expect maybe Nixon's spiritual state, and ends up kind of authorizing Nixon as a good spiritual leader without really doing due diligence to check on the state of his soul.
Yeah, and we'll get to that. My last follow-up question on Graham in a second. If you're listening to this or if you're watching this on YouTube, please subscribe, like, or hit the bell to be notified when a new episode of the Upwards podcast is released. You can also download this episode on your favorite podcast app, and just click the link in the description of the video below, or search for the Upwards podcast. So on Graham and Nixon, I thought I'm sure I'd come across this before, but one of the interesting little episodes is once the transcripts of the Watergate tapes are released, the famous expletive deleted that is sort of just peppered throughout these transcripts of Nixon cussing or saying something inappropriate. And I think Graham's comment was something like, "I almost threw up" or something when he saw that, which is sort of revealing that this was a surprise to Graham. At least that's how he was wanting to position himself, that this was not how Nixon had interacted with him when they talked. So, I mean, this is maybe just a sort of base question, but like, was Nixon a totally different person in a relationship like Graham, or at least did he just check his cussing at the door? And versus how he was, it seems like when he was with his political aides or others, where he sort of let it fly. And did you get a sense, is one of those the real Nixon and one of those the false Nixon, or were both of them the real Nixon? How do you think about that?
I think that's a good way to frame that question. I did go back and check the Watergate or the secret White House recordings with Graham on them to see, like, does he swear around Billy Graham? And he doesn't. Graham is right as far as the record shows that Nixon wasn't cursing around him all of the time. At the same time, what you'll see is that Nixon curses more with some people, right? There's a sense that, like, he's restraining himself around certain people because that's what they want, and that's what will win their approval, is to not drop, F-bombs and other sort of curses. But you also get that same thing in the other direction, right? He curses more around some people, and there are particularly sort of tough guys that he wants to impress, where he will be more cursy and more aggressive, and curiously enough, also like more anti-Semitic. Like, he's more likely to speculate that Jews are evil and secretly control, and that kind of classic, awful anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. He's more likely to drop that around certain people that he's trying to impress and make feel that he's manly or aggressive. But in a way, I think that tells you something. Like, they're all fake Nixons, but the fakeness, the performance, the acting that he's doing tells you the truth of it, which is that he's wildly insecure, deeply insecure, and also kind of always has that part of his brain going where he's trying to think about what the other person thinks of him and would think of him, and trying to, he's not just comfortable enough in his own skin to curse or not curse as he's by his own, character. He's doing it for the other person. He's doing it in an attempt to win the approval of the other person.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. I think another, and maybe that's a pretty human trait of Nixon's as well, is this need to adapt to the people he's trying to impress or pacify and present a certain face to them.
I really hope, as people read this and as people hear me describe these things, that they have both of those thoughts, that you both think, oh, that sounds like a horrible way to live, right? Like, that's too much, that you can't spend all of your time trying to, like, think out ahead of the other person and act and be in a way that will win their approval. Like, you just are at some point going to just have to be confident and just embrace who you are. And at the same time, I hope, following that really quickly, that people have the thought, oh, wait, I do that, right? I hope, this is what started it so much for me, was these moments of recognition that simultaneously I'm saying, oh, how tragic that Nixon was that way, how bad that Nixon was that way, how sad that Nixon was that way. And then immediately following that this second thought of, like, oh, wait, I know what it's like to, be a little more crude around someone who I think is going to approve of that and approve of me, or be a little more polite and a little more proper around someone. And that's just a human way to live, but it's also, it can also be a problem for me and for Nixon.
Yes, and for me too. For just one more sort of analysis of an episode, and then a final question. So I thought one of the most interesting ways you recounted the Watergate scandal from Nixon's perspective, and I'm sure others have pointed this out, but there comes a point where Nixon, at least as you talk about, forgets exactly what he said when he said it. So it's not this all-seeing conspiracy where he's just sort of the master chess player trying to outmaneuver others. there comes a point where he's had so many conversations, maybe so many times where he said different things to different people, that he doesn't actually remember, and he starts listening to the tapes again, trying to just get straight in his own head. What did I say to whom and when? I thought that was just a fascinating insight into, again, a very human thing that I think most of us aren't in a Watergate situation, but we forget exactly who we said to what, and there's different ways you say things to different people depending on what role they play in your life. And I thought that tied in well with some of your themes around how Nixon never felt at home or felt safe in any context, but particularly when he was president. So just talk for a few minutes about what the Watergate scandal, beyond the obvious criminality and the moral depravity of it, what it revealed about who Nixon was.
Man, that tendency he has to talk in long looping circles, interpreting and reinterpreting and reframing everything he did, and saying, well, what if it was like this, and maybe it went like this, and well, you could tell the story this way, and he would kind of speculatively reimagine everything that had happened, and it, that simultaneously makes it really fascinating. I think cover up, he's forced out because of the cover up, not because of the crime. I think normally when you hear cover up, you just think like they hid something, right? Or they like blocked an investigation. And there's that too. But really the lived experience of the cover up was this intensive interpretation and reinterpretation and reimagination of all the details, and the struggle to find just a different way to tell the story of what happened, which I found deeply fascinating at an interpretive level and at a personal level, and insanely hard to write, and it's, you can take snippets from what he says and rearrange them in different ways in telling the story that it sounds really different, like what his position was on this. So that was pretty fascinating. I did find in the archives kind of a memo that's pretty close to him ordering the Watergate break-in. Like he says, someone really needs to look into this guy, get one of these people and the person he suggests is Chuck Colson, who later becomes a prominent Christian after a conversion experience. And Chuck Colson does hire the former CIA agent who breaks into the Watergate, where the office is of the guy that he says to look in. So the memo isn't like, go break the law, but it does say, go do this thing that they then do in the process of breaking the law. But yeah, Nixon just at some point couldn't really hang on to the truth anymore. He's telling stories to himself. He's reimagining his own behavior in the best possible way, and kind of loses touch with what actually happened.
Really well told, and there's many more episodes in the book. One last question I had was about what to take away from this story. And I think there's a version of your biography that would say this is a profile of a high-octane politician, and what he deals with is what many politicians deal with. There's always this tendency to feel like you need to do more, to cut corners, all that kind of stuff. And another interpretation is this is really a Nixon story. This is about a particular person, and we shouldn't read too much into our current political leadership or past presidents or anything on what was really a Nixon problem or a Nixon way of viewing the world, if not a problem. Did you get a sense, do you think Nixon's sort of typical of someone who would dedicate themselves to this type of work? Or do you think he is a unique figure in this sense, and that, if we were to do a biography of Bill Clinton and Obama and, as you said, George W. Bush, we'd have four totally different stories, or would they all sort of have a lot of similarities to them?
I think they'd be different. I think Nixon is Nixon. There's not a lot of little Nixons around. He's got his own deeply peculiar and idiosyncratic way of moving through the world. But I hope at the same time that people find familiar elements and details that connect and that seem similar. I don't think I'm giving you like a skeleton key for every major president and you know everything you need to know. But I do hope that it prompts some investigation with other major figures. And I hope that it makes people think that religious biography is worthwhile, that even if someone is not especially religious or pious or just loves to go to church, that doesn't mean that investigating their spiritual struggles and theological struggles in their dark nights of the soul is worth doing. It can actually tell you a lot about somebody, even if they're not sort of overtly religious. And I also hope that it's a new enough interpretation of Nixon, or different enough from what people have expected or have heard before, that might prompt some second thoughts about other people that you think in public life and think you have a pretty clear understanding of. That maybe you think, there could be a spiritual struggle going on that I actually haven't seen, or maybe I've just caught the barest glimpses of. Nixon is not a super empathetic figure naturally. I try to approach him really empathetically, and I think that could be a takeaway, right? That there's, at least, even if you can't do it now, that maybe in hindsight, maybe with more archives, maybe when that person is not actively making your life worse or the world around you worse, that there might be a way to investigate other political figures empathetically, and seeing them as, most essentially that someone who God loved, whether or not they knew what to do with that, or whether or not they could receive it, or whether or not they could recognize that in other people, that's still the fundamental identity of even hated and hateful American leaders.
Well, the book is One Lost Soul, Richard Nixon's Search for Salvation, out now with Erdman's. Daniel, one of the things I was thinking of when I was reading your book was it's got a similar approach, though different style and everything, to some of the books written by Gary Wills around presidents he wrote a book on the Kennedys, he wrote a book on Nixon and elsewhere. Wills I always find to be a deeply interesting, but also critical, often overly cynical interpreter of some of these people. And I think you have an empathy at the heart of what you're doing that makes you draw different conclusions and makes it a refreshing take on some familiar people. So I commend the book to the audience. And if you don't know anything about Nixon, this is a good way to introduce yourself to one of the 20th century, the most important figures. If you've enjoyed this conversation and you live somewhere near Madison, Wisconsin, we encourage you to attend an event at Upper House in person. And you can see our full program schedule on our website at slbf.org. And finally, thank you for tuning in to the Upwards podcast. Thank you, Daniel, for your conversation today. We hope you've enjoyed the conversation. And for more information about the Stephen and Laura Brown Foundation and Upper House, please visit slbf.org. And go in peace.